So, Your Holiness, we're very happy to see you, and thank you everyone for being present. This morning, Elke covered the current psychological understanding of, and also issues of moving from motivation to action, and the challenges that we face as we're in this global and also local dilemma. Mind and Life, our committee wanted Jimpa to actually go into this question from the Buddhist perspective, and to see what it means from the Buddhist point of view of moving from a base of aspiration, of compassionate or of altruistic aspiration, to engagement, to actually engaging in social and environmental transformation. And so Jimpa will cover this topic, and he is going to be, of course, referencing most of his insights from the Nalanda tradition. You know this, Your Holiness, but I'm just saying this for the benefit of everyone else. Jimpa was trained in the classical Tibetan monastic system, and then he became a father. No, you got married. Some things happened in between. And we loved hearing about your kids in the trash can, so to speak, but never mind. So, but in the meantime, he's become your translator in very frequent meetings, and he's also translated many Tibetan texts, which has been, very important for monastics and Westerners both. He's also an executive member of the Stanford Neuroscience Institute, a visiting scholar of Sea Care, an adjunct professor at McGill, and he is the new board chair of the Mind and Life Institute. And that starts in January, and we're so grateful that you chose to do this, Jimpa. Thank you.
Thank you. Your Holiness, at the beginning, I would like to ask your permission and allow me to step outside my traditional role as your interpreter at these important Mind and Life gatherings. As Roshi John said, that Mind and Life community, and particularly the two coordinators for this meeting, Dan and John, insisted that I make this presentation. So, and for the benefit of the audience, during the presentation, of course, I'll be speaking in my own voice, and once the presentation is over, I'll switch back to my role as the traditional interpreter so that I could serve His Holiness in the role that I'm most comfortable with. Now, of course, one big difference between my presentation and all the preceding presentations is that I'm not making presentations to His Holiness, although I do feel like, as a student of His Holiness, that I'm, in a way, kind of making presentations to you as if I'm sitting down for an examination in front of a master. But the difference is my presentation is primarily targeted to you, primarily the scientists and the scholars who are the speakers, the main participants here, and, of course, the audience. And to some extent, to my monastic, I cannot say to my monastic colleagues, I'm not a member of the monastic community at all, but given my background, addressed to them as well. Of course, as Roshi observed in the introductory commentary, this question of how do we move from a set of belief and motivation then to action and to a behavior change at the individual level is a question that, it's not just contemporary Western psychology alone that has thought about it. This is a question that has, to some extent, been thought quite seriously by most of the philosophical traditions and contemplative traditions as well. And particularly in the Buddhist tradition, this has been a major focus of interest. And this is because in Buddhist tradition, right from the beginning, the idea of spiritual liberation has been understood in terms of kind of training, purification of the mind of its toxin aspects, and training of the mind and perfecting the qualities that are naturally present in our mind. So the whole process of that has been conceptualized and even conceptualized in the form of a journey, a spiritual journey, and the term we use is traveling on the path. So there was this concept of a journey and traveling on the path, and part of that concept involves inevitably a strong belief in the possibility of change and transformation. So then, if that is the question,
basically, according ancient Indian tradition, of course, theistic tradition, non-theistic tradition. Among non-theistic tradition, I think more significant is Jainism and Buddhism. We both, you see, our concept is law of causality. So the of suffering, of course, many levels of suffering. Suffering is due to our wrong action. Wrong action due to wrong motivation. Ultimately, ignorance. So now, in order to overcome suffering, the only thing is remove our ignorance. So now, since the ultimate source of suffering is ignorance, and ultimate source of permanent happiness is ultimately related with wisdom. So both are called mental part. So mind becomes very, very important. And the only way to overcome suffering is training of mind.
So thank you, Your Holiness. And so what I would like to do is to begin with the kind of the big proposal of a conceptual framework in which classical Buddhist tradition tries to understand this whole mechanism of change and transformation. And here, and generally this is kind of always spoken together as a kind of a trio of three things: view, meditation, and action. Tagum Jesum. But view, meditation, and action is kind of a shorthand to really try to put in simple terms within a large umbrella what is essentially a very complex processes and mechanism. So the first part is referred to as view, and for the benefit of my monastic members, I have, now that these days we have Unicode on computer, it's very easy to type Tibetan. I have put the Tibetan in, which is partly out of empathy for an interpreter, and because of my own profession as an interpreter, I have put in the Tibetan term so that he doesn't have to struggle thinking which Tibetan term he's using. So the view, which could also be...
Here, again. Interfering. Now mind is the key factor. So within mind, we must make distinction. Sensorial level mind and the
more thought level.
Thought level. The ignorance, both ignorance and wisdom, not on sensorial level, only the mental level. So sensorial level, Tao Yongsha Kruchan Pyaji.
So the view, the concept of view does not apply at the level of the senses.
So it is, I think, now last several decades, sort of our discussion with modern scientists. There's still, you see, in scientific sort of world, no distinction.
There doesn't seem to be a clear systematic distinctions drawn between sensory versus non-sensory modalities, like conceptual and non-conceptual modalities.
So the sensorial level mind also rather is complicated, but the mental level is even more complicated. So now we are mainly, when we use the training of mind, not sensorial, sharpening our eyes, not that way. The sensorial level, much depend on physical part.
Right.
So it's just some sort of because of the
Hearing aids.
like grass or something. The no too much mission.
At this point, he's only saying he's not quite sure whether there are any sensory devices that would enhance our smelling capacity.
That I don't know. So these are, since you see, these consciousness or mind, you see, sensorial level, so some way, you see, based on physical part. So here, because these sort of mind depend on physical part, so the development also limited. Now we are mainly talking about
the mental level.
Mental level.
So to continue, so in this package that we refer to as view or outlook, Dawa, really can include a lot. So this is really, in some sense, if we think in linear terms, this is the first stage. So this would include understanding the nature of reality, which is more cognitive, using intelligence. And then you have, based on that, adopting some kind of outlook, which is the way in which you see the world. And this is where, Sally was talking about the importance of view and worldview. And then, based upon this understanding, then you have certain attitudes that you develop towards the world and others. And derived from this, then one will have aspirations and values. So this whole kind of, although we may use a short term like view, it refers to a whole set of processes. So this is really one area which is very important. The second area, which is very important part of that process, is again referred to in a shorthand like meditation. And of course, when I use the term meditation, I'm using an English term to translate a Sanskrit and a Tibetan term. And the Sanskrit term is bhavana, which has a connotation to become, to cultivate, to make it. Whereas the Tibetan term has the connotation of cultivating familiarity, familiarization. So in plain English, to really kind of be more liberal in the interpretation, this is essentially referring to a process that is directed to habit formation. So through constant way of learning, a particular way of thinking, way of seeing, way of experiencing, you acquire habit. So this can be seen as kind of using computer language. It's like kind of processing. And we could say this is what allows the knowledge at the intellectual level to become internalized, to be integrated through cultivation of both the wisdom component, intelligence, discernment, insight on the one side, and the more effective motivational component like compassion and so on the other. So in other words, we can look at it including both the effective stance that we learn to acquire and a value stance in relation to the world. So in some sense, this is the classical Buddhist response to the perennial Greek question. Sally referred to the Greek idea that to know good is to do good. But clearly there have been a lot of problems. Someone may know that smoking is bad for his health, but may continue to smoke. So then the question is, why there is a gulf between the knowing something and not doing it? And classical Buddhist, and maybe Indian tradition on the whole would argue that that knowledge has not been internalized through some kind of cultivation. So knowledge on the intellectual level alone is not good. So this would be the Buddhist response to that question, whereas the Greek, of course, have talked about the weakness of the will, akresia, and so on. Then, ideally, once you have formed this kind of habit through internalization and integration, then the ideal would be to engage in action kind of naturally coming out of that transformed states of mind. So that's why, when Claire talked about ethics, one of the points that I raised was that in some sense, if you look at the Western ethical traditions, the Buddhist approach to ethics is much closer to the spirit of virtues ethics, where the focus is not so much on uncovering rules or particular action per se, but it's more on the development of the character of the individual. So the idea is that people will act naturally, ethically, out of that kind of developed character. So this is very much in line with Buddhist way of thinking, and this is a broad conceptual kind of map, which I think, although comes from the Nalanda tradition, but I think it is applicable. I mean, there is nothing specifically religious about this, model, and it may also help, theorists to look at relationship between, intellectual state of knowing and how one can translate that into a specific action. Now, the question is, of course, this is an ideal. Before we internalize and integrate our knowledge and value system into our very being so that we act naturally in the world coming out of it, there is a long period. So then the question is, how do we act on a day-to-day basis when confronted with various ethical challenges, whether it is in relation to environmental issues or whatever. So here I'll be drawing primarily from the writing of a great Nalanda teacher whose influence on the Tibetan tradition is huge, and His Holiness actually referred to this great master Shantideva, whose text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, His Holiness mentioned how he's receiving teachings on that from Kunu Lama Rinpoche really had a radical impact on his own personal thinking. So I'll be drawing primarily from this 8th century Buddhist master. And by the way, I think the Thangka painting of Shantideva is just behind that door. I checked. So I'll be drawing from, he wrote various texts, but 2 texts are hugely influential in the Tibetan tradition, Nalanda tradition. One is the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. The other one is called Compendium of Training. So for the benefit of the Tibetan participants here, I've put in the Tibetan citation. Yes. Long. Yes. So His Holiness is, reminding me that Shantideva's influence is primarily, from the point of view of the Bodhisattva activities and altruistic deeds and actions, then his influence is huge. But when it comes to the understanding the nature of reality and the development of the worldview, then the influence is primarily coming from Nagarjuna and his immediate disciples. So Nagarjuna is here behind me, yeah, and his main disciples are behind you. So here, and one of the beauty of these Nalanda great masters is that they wrote extensively, and they wrote in prose, which generally tends to be quite large, but they also wrote short verses that would summarize these ideas and which lend themselves to easy memorizations. So here, of course, so I'll cite this first. This, he's referring to a particular activity. This is, and he's referring to how to learn to avoid indulging in fruitless activity that are essentially harmful. And he says this is accomplished through constant mindfulness. And then mindfulness comes from a deep dedication. As for dedication, it arises from knowing the benefits of tranquility and striving for it. So you can already see that there are kind of a causal connections being made between these various mental kind of factors, processes. So what Shantideva is pointing out here is that on a day-to-day basis, the key to really living an ethical life is to really bring to awareness what your value system is and what your aspirations are. And this connects very beautifully with Elger's point that coming from contemporary psychology research, that what is important is to keep the intention active and keep the goals active. So this is exactly what Shantideva is pointing out here. We need to learn to have constant mindfulness in the face of everyday kind of challenges. But then the question is, where does this kind of constant mindfulness come from? And then he says it comes from a deep dedication to that particular pursuit. So here, Sally talked about deep awareness. And here, in some sense, this is somewhat similar. Shantideva is talking about, coming from Shindu Kuba, which is really not just a simple respect, but a form of a deep commitment and deep dedication. And then the question is, where does that kind of dedication come from? He says, but that comes from actually knowing the benefits of that particular pursuit, and particularly in the form of tranquility and peace and happiness and joy that will arise from pursuing a particular line of course of action and then striving for it. And then there is a beautiful passage where he immediately identifies what he means by dedication here. He says, now, as for dedication, this refers to turning your mind towards the concerned activities from deep within. So it's like there is a kind of a character development, a value system shift, so that not only do you turn your attention to it, but there is a very strong affective, engagement with this particular pursuit. And then he says, it is an antidote. This is an antidote against carelessness and negligence. So this kind of deep dedication is the best antidote to dealing with carelessness and negligence. So then, of course, since bringing to awareness, mindfulness, one's values and aspirations become so important, then is deep dedication the only source of such constant mindfulness? Here I will cite from Shantideva's other text. He acknowledges there are other ways of bringing that mindfulness to the conscious level. And this is from his other text. And here you can see he says that mindfulness comes easily through, then he lists them, associating with one's spiritual mentor. So this kind of peer group in which you kind of associate with is very important. So shows how environmental influence can be a powerful factor. So for the monastic members, of course, he's primarily thinking about the monastic members, then associating with the right kind of people is very important. And also those who are familiar with Tibetan Buddhist practice, instructions, there's very important emphasis is placed on what is called, associating with the right kind of companions, company. And then another thing that he lists is through the instruction of one's preceptors. So the first one is just kind of being part of a right kind of community. The second one deals with specific instructions from one's teachers. And then he lists also fear as a powerful motivating factor through fear. So this ties to the discussion we had about the role of negative emotions as a motivating factor. And then I would argue that he's...
According Buddhist sort of psychology, or I don't know, about mind. The one mind, like fear, there are variety due to other sort of minds.
Factors.
Factors. Now, some fear, there is real sort of reasons to be feared.
To be afraid
of. That fear is right. And sometimes you see fear actually, no base.
No base.
That's of course just because of the unnecessary trouble. The other fear is necessary. That brings precaution. Right? Then and also anger, combined with compassion, combined with sense of concern of others' well-being. With that sort of, because of the mind, and anger, positive. That anger brings more energy, essentially positive, beneficial energy. Jealousy, hatred, and with that, you see, anger, that's a negative. Then similarly, ego, feeling of I, strong self. Strong self, which bring more enthusiasm to do some positive thing. That kind of egoistic sort of attitude is right, positive. Then another sort of this feeling of sense of strong self, which you see lead, bully other, or harm other,
exploit others,
or exploit other, cheating other. that kind of sort of the sense of strong self is negative. So mind still lives on it. Kore 모두 짠짠 나서 다시 동도가 positive negative side. 그래 그 유드 뒤드 충댕이로 좀 망고 지내도 되는 거 같지.
So His Holiness is making the point that when we are talking about mental processes, we are talking about very, very complex phenomena. So we cannot really pinpoint the particular mental factor and say this is positive or this is negative. You know, we have to take into account its function in a given context and the, you know, many other factors that are part of that process. So we cannot really kind of make a categorical judgment that say, you know, a strong sense of self is wrong or strong sense of self is right.
그렇게 해서 믿어봤을 때 창원하고 배 잉으로 잘 지도 토틀레스네스. 토틀레스네스 림보 먹고 쉬우시도 가. 지금이나 먹고 쉬우시도 가.
So similarly, for example, and these days a lot of people in their enthusiasm for meditation, you know, values a state of thoughtlessness. But again, you know, it may sound simple, but there are many different levels of thoughtlessness.
Sometimes I jokingly telling, this is some rabbit, no immediate danger, their stomach full, then they also thoughtlessness sort of state of mind. So there are variety. So it is very, very important, you see, to know one thing, we have to look all the sort of
different angles.
Angles. Otherwise, you see, there are 야 되게 내 지금 내도 지수데 내 탑지 디콜로셀에 얘기 사거든.
So otherwise, there would be always the temptation to go to that extreme of, you know, which His Holiness gave the example, taking one grain of one grain and then trying to argue that all the grains must exactly be the same. So, of course, Shantideva acknowledges that fear can be an important motivating factor. And then finally he lists, and which I would argue is his favored kind of, you know, source of mindfulness, which is then he says, to the fortunate who are dedicated. So he refers to the people who have deep dedication to be the fortunate ones, because in them mindfulness will arise quite easily. So what we see here is a kind of, you know, of course I'm being very, very crude in my kind of, you know, presentation of the complex mental processes, but I think I personally find this kind of delineation and unpacking of this process from belief and knowledge to actual action, you know, at least in my own personal life, very beneficial. Now, of course, we all know, and Elke pointed that out particularly very, very powerfully, that human beings are very, very complex beings with all sorts of competing, you know, values and mental processes operating at the same time. And also, together with that, there are also many other, you know, factors that are very part of our psychology, one of which is the basic laziness. You know, Elke actually gave an interesting example of how one can turn that laziness into a kind of an opportunity. But laziness has been a major question for the Buddhist, you know, psychologists like Shantideva and others. And so one thing that I thought I could share with the scientists and the philosophers and contemplative scholars here is a particular kind of classical Indian Buddhist take on how to deal with the problem of laziness. And first of all, and this kind of idea originally comes, not originally, but more systematically developed in Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu's writings. They are 4th century great Indian Nalanda masters. And both of them, interestingly, come from the Peshawar region, which is modern-day Pakistan. So in the classical Buddhist psychology, we unpack laziness into various components or aspects. You have laziness in the form of just simple procrastination. I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow. And this is probably one of the most common one that we are all familiar with. And, you know, of course, I know from my own personal experience, this is something that is a close friend to all of us. And then the other one, the second one, is a very interesting concept. And normally we won't associate this with a kind of a laziness. And this is referred to as habitual indulgence in contrary behavior. So, and we wouldn't normally see this as kind of a laziness in contemporary psychology, but it is, you can see that as a form of laziness because it's a kind of avoidance. It's a form of laziness in the form of avoidance. And then finally, the other important laziness is, being discouraged. And sometimes this form of laziness is referred to as dañila nieba, means kind of almost like kind of insulting oneself, an insult to oneself. So this is where kind of, lack of confidence and, kind of really having a much lower esteem to one's own capacity. So this is also seen as a laziness because it prevents us from acting out. And then the remedies or the antidotes that these great Buddhist masters suggest to counter them, one of them is teba, is shraddha, but it's a very complex term which often is translated as faith, but probably the faith is the wrong word here. It is admiration, it is confidence, it is trust. It has both cognitive as well as affective, dimension. So we will use this as, I have tepa in my teacher, which is not a cognitive sense. It's like kind of a sense of entrustment. I entrust myself to the guidance of my teacher. So that's one important factor. The second one is aspiration, that you would want to have, strong aspiration. And third is effort. And the fourth one is interesting. It's suppleness, but also has a very strong component of joy. And this concept of joy as a counterforce to laziness, joy as a motivating factor, is a very important concept that runs through the writings of many great Indian Buddhist masters, including the great Nalanda masters. And this, I think, is an idea that I think contemporary psychology, particularly science of behavior, could really take into account. Because we know from our experience of being parents that when we are struggling to teach our children to take one instrument, like one of my daughters played piano and the other one violin, initially it's a hard job, taking them to the classes. Of course, I don't, Sophie, my wife drives. And then, we would want them to take one sport. And initially, it is a lot of hard work. But once they get to a point where they take pleasure in it, then we know from our experience, then it's much easier for them to ask them to do something. And same thing goes for studies. If a child takes joy in the study, then it's much easier for that child to really do the homework and stuff. So the joy has clearly an important role to play. But joy need not necessarily be, and here we talked about the power of positive emotions associated with, pursuit and ideas. But here, we should not confine our concept of joy in a very simple terms, because people can learn to take joy in something that may be hard, but because of the value system. So the athletes take great joy, in what they do because they value winning. They value that particular thing that they do. And it's this value, the strong value that you accord on a particular pursuit when you accomplish something. You have a deep sense of joy. And those kind of sense of joy is really cultivated sense of joy. But once you have the value incorporated into your being and your aspiration is so strong, then the joy comes through the pursuit. And I think this is an important insight coming from the classical Indian Buddhist and Tibetan tradition that we need to look seriously into, and which could have implications in the way in which we design things, curriculum, and so on for children. And His Holiness talked about, potential benefits of adapting, Tibetan monastic debate style. And the reason why this is that you can see, if you can observe monks debating, one of the important, interesting, immediate observation is that it's very joyful. People are laughing, it's very physical, it's animated, and so you can see how...
Not always.
Not always.
Sometimes, even you see the one
Debaters.
Yeah.
Debaters.
May lose temper.
That's true. So, so finally, I'll just summarize what I have said here in this kind of crude, you know, my own training is in humanities, philosophy, and religion, and we're not used to using PowerPoints with nice charts and stuff. So I'm
Was
slowly
it?
learning how to use this. And so to sum up, the insights coming from the Nalanda Indian and Buddhist tradition, we see these are the kind of steps. So you begin with awareness, and His Holiness always emphasizes awareness. But awareness has to be deep, and that kind of awareness comes from weighing the pros and cons, cost-benefit analysis. So initially, the role of cognition and intelligence and discernment plays a very important role. And then based on that awareness, then you learn to admire it. You learn to, once you have admiration, then you will aspire it. And on the basis of aspiration, then you learn to develop confidence and deep dedication that we spoke about, which will then lead to more effort and joy and enthusiasm on your part, which will then allow you to make that pursuit and goal and intention active in your mind, and which hopefully will then lead to action. So Elke talked about how we use different mechanisms to move from, motivation to action. Sometimes rules are more effective, and Buddhist tradition would acknowledge that because although the importance of discernment and insight and intelligence is so crucial in this kind of process, but when it comes to dealing with the life on a day-to-day basis, the ideal is always to be able to respond immediately by being able to bring to mind whatever your value and what your aspirations are. So I would argue that the role of intelligence and insight and wisdom seems to be very crucial in the cultivation of those kind of values and how we see ourselves, what kind of things we value. And here there are important implications for teaching those kind of values very early in children. His Holiness gave the example of how Tibetan children instinctively avoid stepping on bugs. That's a culturally acquired value. And once you have internalized that value, then the behavior comes very naturally. I mean, Tibetans would immediately cringe when someone steps on a bug. I mean, so this is a culturally acquired value. So once you have internalized the value, so before you internalized for grown-ups, I think it is, of course, the role of intelligence and discernment and weighing the pros and cons become very important. But later on, when confronted with actual ethical dilemma, when there are competing values, in a given situation, then again the role of intelligence and wisdom become very, very crucial because we have no way of adjudicating. But in most of our lives, ideal scenario would be to be able to draw from our value system and aspirations and act naturally in the best possible way to a given situation. And these are things which I think I have personally found very beneficial. And also at the beginner's stage, all the great Buddhist masters of Indian Nalanda tradition and the Tibetan masters as well always emphasize the importance of environment. So for example, for the monastics, a great emphasis is placed on avoiding situations where you might be confronted with the possibility of breaking a vow. So creating the right kind of environment seems to be very important because there's a beautiful line in Asang Vasubandhu's text where he says that those of us who haven't gotten rid of our strong emotional afflictions, if we are confronted with proximity of a temptation, and then we are likely to project qualities of attractiveness and desire, then of course we are going to act in an afflicted manner. So these kind of insights suggest that there's a role both for the individual to take measures to transform his or her mind, but also to seek some kind of environmental changes so that the person is protected from finding himself or herself in a situation one would act in a negative manner. And here, we talked about voluntary simplicity or voluntary poverty. And one thing that people in the West, in the consumerist culture, where I've been living for almost 20 years now, is that they don't people tend to look at simplicity always in negative terms of lacking something, depriving of something. But actually, simplicity frees you. For example, if a family has 2 cars, then you have all sorts of things that comes with 2 cars. You have the bills to pay for 2 cars, the insurance to pay for 2 cars, all the paperwork, and all of this, and then the garage space, and then the parking. Whereas if there's only 1 car, then the question is, there would be times when there would be conflict. Then you take a taxi or a public transportation, and it's maybe exert a little bit of inconvenience, but economically also, that's a much cheaper and efficient way of dealing with the question of getting a second car. So people tend to kind of forget that simplicity actually can lead to greater quality of life. So I think those kind of things are, I think, important. And these are, as Sally pointed out, that one can... No.
가람 공부지 손이야. 초시전기 고하나 추부권의 시기였어. 더버전이 맞았다스. 그래서
No. So there is actually, His Holiness was reminding me that there is a beautiful line from one of the Kadamba masters. He says that in the room or in the home of a person who is contented, a truly rich person is sleeping, and
that's mentally very rich, contented, very happy, so very peacefully, restful.
And then he says that, but the greedy does not recognize this.
So sometimes some my close friend, some businessmen, I usually teaching them, you are slave of money, always running. One time I was in Moscow, so one Russian who helped my the accommodations
host.
So he told me he have to go to San Francisco or Los Angeles. I think 16, 18 hours from Moscow flight. And remain there 2-3 hours, and then return. Difficult. For money, you see, they sacrifice this kind of hardship.
So it's very true what this Kadamba master said. So to summarize, my main point is that looking at the insights coming from the contemporary psychology, science of behavior, and also from the Buddhist psychology, clearly there are, it's not kind of, there are stages in the mental processes that goes from knowing to action, where people can take more proactive approaches to really kind of transform their, value system and aspiration. And on the level of each individual, and they can also, each of us can really make a difference, and which was a theme that has been constantly coming up in this meeting. Thank you. I'll now step back to my traditional role. Yeah.
So we'd love to hear any comments. Any comments or questions? Mathieu.
Is to connect that with some of kind of the dilemma that we had this morning about reconciliating, presenting the full picture of suffering, and also having a positive sort of view of things. And I think this relates perfectly well with what you said and the concept of the Four Noble Truths. So there was a kind of seemingly contradiction this morning. Should we insist on the aspect of suffering, the negative aspect, whatever goes wrong and everything? And His Holiness pointed out, if we don't fully assess the suffering and its cause, then we will not be able to take the proper measures. But then if we stop there, say that's the first noble truth, So maybe we can understand the causes as well, but still we are not out of trouble. So if we stop there, then we adopt a very pessimistic outlook, means it's hopeless. Everything is bad, it's not only going to go wrong, and we are going to go down, and that's it. So as His Holiness once said, I remember very well, he said, in that case, don't bother to think about suffering. Is exaggerating your torments, go to the beach and drink a good beer. But now if the third noble truth comes in, there is a solution, there's a possibility. And that possibility is what gives the positive image. But unless you know the full characteristics of the suffering, and then, of course, it's sort of, you would not know how to apply or actualize the potential for the actualization of removing the suffering. So then it comes to the notion of joy, because once you know that there is a possibility of removing suffering, then optimism is there will be a solution, there is a potential, even the circumstance looks bad, there are many causes and conditions involved, and then we can get out of trouble. So the methods, the fourth noble truth, come into the picture. So not to be a pessimistic is not to say that the bad aspects are intrinsic, and we are hopeless, and I am hopeless, and there's no solution. So you will never have the courage, the joyful effort, or the virtuous joy to engage in the solution. But if you know the full picture, that there are certainly problems, those causes can be identified, and the potential for removing, then the methods come. So it becomes a much fuller picture, and we can combine very well, presenting the negative aspect of the situation with the very encouraging aspect of the potential for solution. So that sort of integrates also the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mathieu. That was very, very cogent, helpful. Elke, I wonder if you have some reflections. We would really appreciate hearing your perspective on what Jimpa was addressing.
What resonates or doesn't resonate?
And one thing that strikes me, it's a very nice integration of these different levels of analysis, that Western psychology also emphasizes. On the one hand, that we sort of know things analytically, after very careful decomposition of the problem into its components, and then reassembling it and really deeply understanding it, but with our heads. But then also the appreciation of reality through, I don't want to use the word holistic because I'm going to get into trouble, but through more
holistic stanye peruchik message nguran chudan de kunyu komashina ta de
but through more to less analytic and maybe more association and more affect-based processes. And I think what the Buddhist approach does very nicely, rather than sort of saying they coexist and they maybe sort of feed into each other, it spells very nicely how they interact with each other and how they go back and forth. How awareness and cognitive processing actually can lead to an emotional experience that's positive, then can feed back into different rational analysis.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Greg.
I'd just like to share that we've heard several times today, His Holiness this morning emphasized that there are three levels of understanding: hearing, critical reflection, and experience. And then again this afternoon we've learned that there are these two levels of mind, sensory level and then the deeper mental level. And I think I'm realizing that the term awareness, at least I've been translating much too shallowly. It's something about your full being is aware. And I'm just asking myself, I don't have the answer, but I'm asking myself how in the field that we work in, really I'm echoing you, but I'm saying I feel a challenge to our field. We tend to just convey the information at the surface level. It's an eco label that says this is a green product, or it's a computer that says this is 22 kilograms, but we're missing the two levels. And so I'm just going to be asking myself, how can we communicate over time? That's the other message, of course, from Buddhism, is that this takes practice and time. So I'll be asking, how can we cultivate practices which deepen the awareness of both the environmental impacts of our actions and the benefits that we might achieve.
들으셔 고란도 다는데 나중에 송단도 군두가 남보다 게 프레젠테이션도 예배가야 지 누조베 내가 지나는 상무 퇴중간이야 샤셰베 소리지 또 스타다는 디 군두가 스티갈 삼중다는 공중스 녀게 가면 안 되갈 다 디네주디 퇴중간 마샤바제 추 삼중다네 진용회가 밥에 답시를 주 가려나 스페는데 고유된 데버 요버디기디 고란신의 삼당고에게 시르부 차샤스도
I think our friends here, you see, you all, most cases, you see, firstly, you learn from your teacher or from books, the first level of awareness, understanding. Then you carry research work. So that's the second level. So through your own research and experiment, then the result of something always same way happen. Then develop conviction. Then decide this is true. So that's the second level. Then perhaps I think, like I think those the sophisticated big sort of aeroplane, the pilot in front of them, so many sort of switches. If I'm there. In aeroplane that would drive. So you see, I think they handling these without sort of thinking, automatically come. That's the reverse mission.
So that's the third level, when it becomes internalized and experiential, almost like automatic.
다음에 띵인진 그 검도 제베 검중 싫어 떨러 두고 말했대. 얘네다 공부하신 왜 싫어.
Of course, in very, very strict technical usage of the term, sometimes the third level of understanding is also defined in terms of very high levels of concentrative power. But generally generally one can also apply it to the question of becoming habituated.
So the yoga
The Quran country shwe tere ta samtang we the milba ta buku mishinda so le te chebe ka be tan de tyung kan ma do phalabe shir ji
that the Quran so homework then that temang's loss any giging ma t-shirt de 가서 그래 봐. 다 당선 맞네. 다네. 다 디지 gendu tishudas. 다 tilawor.
So, Greg, if I understood your question right correctly, you were thinking more in terms of how to communicate that with others, not just at the first level, but at the second and third. And His Holiness was saying that to move from the first level, which is just labeling and information-driven, to the second level with relation to sharing with others, is to really kind of, have some form of challenge that, people like students studying environment are forced teachers
should tell them this is the sort of basis. Then you yourself usually analyze and bring questions
especially
and contradictions. So they will find, and then you can give some kind of award. Those students who bring more questions, more critical questions, then give some kind of award. So that's the way to bring to enthusiasm. 나도 배지당에 먼구지게 타버 되는 전에 따스던 게 요말다. 답그 소프트웨어 서치. 그 카드기 서비스 되게 무시하다 거다.
So it's saying that even in the monastic debating, environment, it's not always the case that the person who's so dedicated to debating is being motivated by higher ideals like seeking, liberation, but rather to really put someone on the spot. So when someone succeeds in doing so, then people say, "Oh, he was brilliant. He put the other guy in his place." Then people get a deep sense of satisfaction.
So you see, student, give them some kind of opportunity,
To encourage.
enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm.
if they carry more sort of analytical sort of study. Then bring some sort of contradictions, what teacher stated. Then give them praise. Oh, you're sort of I myself also, you see, when I was very young, you see, my tutor always very, very reserved. I think some of you already know. When I initial level, when I study, my teacher always keep one whip. I usually say, how joke or telling that whip, color yellow whip. So suppose the student, Dalai Lama, holy student. So whips also should be holy. So yellow whip. But I know if the holy yellow whip use, I know, you see, no differences, holy pain or ordinary pain. So out of fear, I carry my study. But that sort of effort not come from within. But then gradually later, you see, my teacher praise, oh, your mind is very sharp. Oh, your memory is very good. And your ability to analyze things, very good. Then I get more enthusiasm. Then effort comes from within, like that. So that's, I think, everywhere are the same. So I think the teachers, I think something, I think much depends on the teacher's side.
Teacher's skill now.
And the monastic scholars, teachers, some just to explain according to text. Those top sort of scholars, text they sounds lost.
So even in the monasteries, you see different styles of teaching. Some teachers generally tend to explain the text word by word, but some more skilled instructors, they would say the text you can read, but then he picks out the problem, the more difficult, points from the text, and then he debates with them and analyzes them and problematizes them. So here His Holiness was saying that he shares with the members of the monastic community that
so far
So even though the kind of the debating tradition is supposed to emphasize one's personal understanding and the debating techniques and reasoning, but there is of course a custom to generally always cite important authorities and try not to go beyond the boundaries of these important thinkers. So His Holiness has expressed the wish that on particular subjects like middle way philosophy or epistemology and other topics where it's relevant, we should move away from this general practice and cite less the authority of great thinkers of the past, but more really pursue the line of inquiry, critical inquiry.
Dekila. I'm sorry. Yeah, I know.
Sure, it's on. Okay.
Yeah, it is.
So I felt very happy to see the phrase joy and enthusiasm because I think most environmental activists have this feeling that we're actually optimists pretending to be pessimists. And but at the same time, in fact, very recently I read an article that said they're actually looking, in psychology, they're looking at a particular kind of depression that environmental activists are facing because activists are screaming out as loud as they can about the environmental problems we're facing, and it often feels like nobody's listening. So there is a real issue of depression and exhaustion that's taking place among environmental activists. And when I look at this, the Buddhist psychology of action, my question to His Holiness and to yourself, Jimpala, is when that happens, how do we, from a Buddhist perspective, change this feeling of exhaustion and depression?
Now, that's how I'll do it. I think from the Buddhist point of view, one thing that I would say is that
Shantideva just sorry. Yeah, Chao did some of the Dagjish.
His Holiness was again citing from Shantideva, where he makes a very important point that before you commit yourself into a particular line of work and take on a challenge, it is important on your part to really kind of evaluate that pursuit and to see whether it is to your capability or not. And once you are committed, then you shouldn't have second thoughts about it. But you should not just rush and grab onto something that you are not able to kind of handle. So that is one general advice that comes from Shantideva. But the other advice that His Holiness often gives is that when we are in the heat, in the middle of some kind of pursuit, like environmental activism, and you feel so overwhelmed and nobody's listening, you feel kind of alone, then it is important to step out and take a kind of a wider perspective. And this is often what His Holiness recommends to in many other areas, not just environmental. Because sometimes what happens is that when you look at a particular issue so close up, you don't see the wider picture, the wider context in which this particular event or problem has a role. So then you feel so overwhelmed. But simply by shifting the space from which you look at the problem can have an impact. Another thing that His Holiness quite often advises is that people need to constantly make an effort to really cultivate joy, look back in time. And His Holiness gives his own personal experience in his own spiritual development. He says that if he were to, kind of look at the progress in terms of very short time frame, then there isn't much to feel joyful about. But if he compares himself to a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, then there's clearly a tremendous room for joy. So similarly, I think with the environmental movement, I think one thing that probably is helpful is to take this advice and apply it, because there are many areas in which environmentalists have had tremendous success. The fact that most of the schools, at least in the developed countries, children are being taught environment, have projects about environment, is a great achievement. I mean, it's seeping into the wider cultural value. So these are important achievements. I think that these are the things that I would suggest. I mean, of course, I'm drawing from His Holiness's advice. Yeah.
Diana.
So while we're seeking advice and counsel on things that worry us deeply, I'm wondering if there's anything I can draw from this perspective to help in conversations with people who are very skeptical about climate change. And even to have some of those people who are very skeptical are actually taking actions like funding politicians who are not doing the right thing about climate change. So on the occasions where I have the opportunity to talk to people like that, is there anything I can learn about how to approach somebody who would look at that graph that I show of rising temperatures and almost be in denial about it? Are there any lessons I can learn about converting skeptics?
Chita iche mache pa samda maase pa iche mache pa tiki ya chabsi pa le shukin teje di to ne ya siju le yon du korwa ta tu zuri le ya lo ju wa ta ya tapshir si kare na snang pe ngoi ne so lap chalen je
Shantideva nala tingdoa katang the rabjit chimdi kada lovengi loma jengzuti so da loma be come the me but doing tinashdoa the do young restriction milkida milky shedu
Yes. His Holiness, citing from a second century or maybe second century classical Indian text authored by this master here, Aryadeva, who was a student of Nagarjuna.
Chief, main student,
principal student of
senior
Nagarjuna.
student.
In his text called 400 Stanzas on the Middle Way, he talks about the skillful ways, means that are necessary on the part of the teachers when he or she is communicating certain ideas or points to a student. And one important point he raises is to take into account the sensibilities and mental disposition of the listener, the student. So adapting your message to the sensibility and mentality of the other person is a very important lesson one can learn. Yeah.
My own little experience, when we talk with someone, there may be some different views and disagreement. First, I consider because of that another human being. On the human being level, no differences. I want happy life. He or she also is want happy life. And make closer
Connection.
Right from beginning, your profession, their profession, something different, and a different nationality, different faith, or different races. From that position, talk. Sometimes unnecessary sort of barrier may be there. So how to
Remove.
make use how to
Remove the barrier.
that develop some kind of closeness feeling with that person as a human being. We both want same goal, happy life. Now, how to achieve that? This is my view, your view. Same aim, same human being. Then the other side, automatically, you see, develop some kind of kasota attitude, more desire to find some closer, making common effort. The right from the beginning is to talk on the basis of sort of
Differences.
Then that person may love difference, and from the difference sort of positive,
A defensive standpoint.
defensive
Standpoint.
stand, then offensive. That's no use. That better not talk. So the number of cases at the beginning, little bit distance, then talk, build some kind of closeness because of the
Feeling.
connection
No.
from the fundamental level. Then become easier. This is my view.
Wonderful. Sally and then John. Yeah. Is that a... Say what? Oh, okay.
Yes, this is addressed to both of you. And I'm wondering what we do about the problem of superficial knowledge coming to deep awareness. And in our time now, we have so much information on the internet, and it's very easy to find out information about everything. So people all think that somehow that the information is going to give them quick solutions. They want the solution. All right, I know things are bad. What is the answer? The sort of magic bullet. And what I hear from you folks saying is that we need deep knowledge, and one sees how in monks with lives of deep meditation, this could occur, this change. And I have been studying the lives of the saints for many years and have learned the same thing, that the gradual journey of spiritual development in their lives is so impressive. But then I think, how do we answer the question for most people who say, what should I do? And what they really mean is, what is the quick solution for this? What would the Buddhist answer be for moving from superficial knowledge, information from the internet, to deep knowledge?
그래서 또 그래.
등산 다제 잡에 두주 인자다 내주 담에다 망부 시부지 편지 뭐 여러 봐. 내주 마신 뭐 집어 뭐 내주 망자베 겐게. 디네 다다 내주 심버들 알렌 따라야리야. 다 나주다 다 줄로신다게 루귤 때베나. 지야나 로곰 곰잡데 되게 돈에. 디체전 줘볼 줘 되게 걸었어. 다 다들 두주 명망부지가 다
시세데 라리게와 게메와.
라레.
그래서 그렇지.
다디 답시를 가려놔서 돈 대부지게 돈은 다가나 시제담에다 망부시 비가 요주가 피네소 직 렌제 돈 대부지게 돈을 알렌다야 답시 가려놨어.
라지로다.
His Holiness.
그래서 그래서 제우 그래서 하고 있어. 시야도 시기도 시기도 뒤들 알게 하게 바로.
So His Holiness is saying that
the internet are you the information. 뒤들 알게 하게 바로.
I mean, first of all, not all informations are necessarily something that we would want to put into practice. And then he, suggested that I try to respond. Looking at this question, I mean, it is a serious question and challenge for those of us who live in the on a constant information age, with multiple emails that are coming on a daily basis, and also with the Google and all of this just super highway of information, general kind of attitude in the West, and I would expect it to be shared by the Eastern societies as well, is that the idea, other than the of course authoritarian societies, is that the more information is the better. But we do know that more information need not necessarily be better in the sense, because we become paralyzed. And the question is, how do we, find a way of dealing with this? And here again, I would go back to the great Nalanda masters and really kind of ask the fundamental question: what kind of value system do we want? And once you have sorted that out, and of course within that you would have certain priorities. And then, based on that value system, you would have certain aspirations in life, and the immediate or long term. And then when you are confronted with this deluge of information, you will have a kind of a very shorthand way of sorting them out. That's relevant, that's not relevant, and you may want to indulge in certain reading for the sake of enjoyment, but for your own practical application, you will have a kind of a mechanism to sort those out, and once you internalize that mechanism, then it becomes fairly quick, so I think that is what I would suggest from taking from the Nalanda masters insights.
John, and then Jonathan.
I think that there might even be something in your presentation, Chimpala, that might speak to this, Your Holiness, and it's actually part of the question that I wanted to ask, which is you have a term in there to describe the function of mindfulness or jampa or smriti, which is a khedusupa, that it blocks this khedusupa, which I can't remember the Sanskrit right now, but that you translated as carelessness. But I think that term also has a sense of being sort of overwhelmed, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A sense, because usually mindfulness is described as that which prevents distraction, so that the mind does not go off to a distractor. But what's interesting about that term, if I'm getting it right, and I'd love to hear your comment or His Holiness's comment about this, but I think the implication of that term when you say khedusupa is actually not that there's a hook in the distractors, so to speak, that it is something that is really actively pulling the mind away. Something is becoming salient and one is losing track of one's main point, one's main goal. In other words, instead of keeping the eyes on the prize, as you sometimes hear in American English, one is now distracted onto something else. And I think what it's saying here in terms of this pattern is that the role of mindfulness, this version of mindfulness, this style of mindfulness, is to prevent that kind of scattering.
Yeah.
The sort of scatterbrained approach, where, oh, well, let's look at this, let's look at that, let's try this, let's try that. And I'm actually, to some extent, I think that is a function of what value system you have, but I think it's also actually a function of a certain kind of training, a capacity for concentration, a capacity to maintain a sort of calm mind, even especially in difficult situations. And I'm not, I suppose maybe I'm even recommending that a little bit of some kind of basic meditation, maybe secular style of mindfulness meditation or something along those lines might actually be part of what you're asking for. Because I think that there is a great tendency in our modern life for there to be things that create this effect of chia de supa, being overwhelmed, of pulling our attention away, seeming to be salient, seeming to be important, but actually they're not, they're just superficial. So in some ways, part of the Buddhist answer here is not at all cognitive. It's really about the development of certain kinds of cognitive capacities for concentration, a stable form of concentration.
Thank you, John.
Yes, I'd agree. Simone Weil, a French philosopher, said that even a child working on a math problem is a way to increase attention, paying attention to something. It doesn't have to be prayer, although prayer is an example, but being able to pay attention seriously to solving a math problem can be a lesson in in-depth awareness and attention. It's so rare when we really, really pay attention to something outside ourselves. And I think you're right. What the internet has done is to help students gain a tremendous number of connections to different sorts of information. They follow down that path and this path and that path, but they don't go deeply into the center and how to help educationally, especially in light of the computer now, which is going to be in many ways the main way that people read and learn. How do we develop that radical attention to the thing itself and to pay attention to it with some depth as another subject, as something important in itself?
Sure.
I think Jonathan had something up.
I put the microphone down because I think my question has been raised. I think that you've heard the saying, chance favors a prepared mind, that unless we're really prepared and paying attention, that we won't learn, we won't make discoveries. But I think this has been talked about. The only other issue I was going to raise is based on that. I wonder about the awareness. You first need to be mindful so that you can become aware. You need to be awake, and so you can learn things. But I also wanted to ask you, you brought up smoking. And of course, when I think about smoking, people can't just decide to quit because they're addicted.
Sure.
And so many of our behaviors are addictions. People argue that we are addicted to oil and that everything around our lives is this addiction to, it's based on oil. So how do you deal with these extra challenges of addictive behavior?
So, of course, one obvious thing would be to try to weigh the pros and cons of a particular behavior. But other than that, His Holiness was saying there is not much he has to say.
로봇 가셔야 타마니 미르 댄체 엔 사실 가셔 타마 테마 줘서 그 가서 pen 거로
Naril.
가셔야 되는 더 나기 말 취하시는 야 마도 저거
So we do see societal differences in some parts of the world. The cigarette smoking is taken very seriously, particularly in the public space. So you have important signs, and so people modify their behavior accordingly. But then in some countries, there doesn't seem to be that kind of caution, exercise from the on the public level. Then we see more people smoking. So we see societal differences as well.
저 소소 나네 미 당도라네 보내자 지은 거지 야 그걸 룰고 안에 보내자 있고.
So this shows that there are two ways in which we can, we need to deal with this. One is, of course, the individual self-motivation. And then at the same time, there could be a more societal kind of, measures that are taken, so that they can be both ways. Yeah.
내가 다가서야 개경들은 awareness가 레벨이야.
So when we speak about, weighing pros and cons, again we are coming back to the point about awareness, the role of awareness.
Elka.
Both my presentation and your presentation really dealt with individual action. So I'm wondering sort of what prescription or what diagnosis, your framework gives for collective action, where we have to coordinate actions between individuals.
Yes, it's very true. And generally, if you look at psychology, whether it is contemporary Western psychology or classical Buddhist psychology, generally they tend to be kind of, from the perspective of an individual. Because, that's the nature of that particular discipline. And because when we try to take into account the societal impact, social psychology is much more complicated business. One of the things, but there is an awareness both in the contemporary psychology and also in the Buddhist psychology of the important role that influence that the surrounding and environment exercises upon our behavior. So if you look at many of the instructions in the Buddhist text, there are constant reminders of that point, although it was never systematically developed as a subfield of psychology, but the recognition is there. And here, again, in the end, His Holiness always reminds us that whether we talk about society or community, in the end, the units are individuals. It is individuals, collection of individuals that compose society, that compose community. So although at the emergent level, there may be certain properties that the collective display that the individual may not display, but the fact is a community and societies are collections of individuals. So the Buddhist approach on the whole has been to really emphasize the individual approach, so that if the individuals within a collective changes, the collective is naturally going to change. But of course, when it comes to environmental issue, which is the topic of our concern here, then it's much more complicated. And part of the challenge really comes from the fact that what needs to be done is not that clear. And also the recommendations that are coming have huge immediate implications of our behavior and our lifestyle. I remember more than 20 years ago, I had the honor to accompany His Holiness to Germany, and there was, soon after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of discussion about the New World Order, and His Holiness was part of a small group of thinkers that spent about 2 days discussing, this whole question of emergence of a New World Order. And I remember very, very vividly, His Holiness made this very important point. He said, at some point, the affluent Western societies, including Japan and others, really need to take seriously the whole premise of modern economy, where there is a belief in a perpetual growth. Yeah. And the growth is used as a measurement of the success of economy. And sooner or later, the people living in the affluent societies will have to learn to somehow bring down their standard of life in terms of consumption. And I remember being very struck, because that was one of the very early days I've ever been to the West. I think it was fairly early, and I was very struck by that. And I think this is increasingly being pointed out. In one of the constant themes was the problem of consumerism. And we are so used to thinking that this is the way to live. And the governments are so used to assessing their success or failure by using only that measurement. So the question is, how do we change that? And so there needs to be a movement both from the individual level, but also at this larger societal level as well.
I may add one thing. The material value and I think inner value or spiritual value. See, we day by day, we use these two values. Although we I think most people not knowing fully about this inner value, but as I mentioned yesterday, just restful, relax.
No, relax.
So that's the, of course, physical relax also there, but the main thing is mental relax. So everybody has experienced the importance of inner value. So now here, material value. In any case, there is limitation. Mental inner value, no limitation. Material, there is sort of the physical, so there is limitation. The inner value, no physical. So it's the physical measure,
So then there is nothing to obstruct its further development.
So, according to that reality, in material value, it is better practice of contentment. Because there's in any way limitation. The inner value is concerned, no limit. So should not content. But we just opposite. Inner value, no bother, and content. Where actually, we can go infinitely.
Further along, far.
Far. But the material value, in any case, there is limitation. We always want more. Again, this lack of awareness.
So, a question that I just want to bring out, has to do with the lack of contentment of probably everybody in this entire room with regards to what's happening to our Earth and to human beings on our Earth and all of the living systems. That lack of contentment, I think, is, at least from the perspective of some of us, is really essential. It has to do with addressing the truth of suffering, the first noble truth that Mathieu was referring to. What about the mandate? Is there a mandate within Buddhism to engage directly in social and environmental transformation? To actually, become proactive, to deal with the psychosocial and the political issues directly? Or are we, taking another approach?
His Holiness was saying that when the great Nalanda masters, particularly the 17 who are displayed here, were alive, of course the society of India was very, very different from today. So he was, we probably need to invite them to come today and then ask their advice.
Then in the Nangwe Bijanaloya, sociology survey, that you got that is hungry.
So the point His Holiness is making is that if they had written in our age, they would have definitely talked about sociology and
Ranamala, the Morigitanala, Jizo Pod in the Sudo.
so this
Never
said,
tasted Tedugi, quite a primitive society.
so this said, of course, in texts such as Ratnavali, composed by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century,
Ranamala,
Mala Vali,
Ratnavali,
Mala Sanantigor Lao. Ratnamala, which is composed by Nagarjuna as a letter to a king, has very explicit sections dealing with the king's social responsibilities to his subjects. Of course, His Holiness was saying that we do have to take into account that he was writing at a time where the social structures were very different, and one could also say more primitive.
누가 가.
So Ashoka.
다 대시 대륙 지속 내다 진짜 지속 거로다. 저는 민제요 가사 가사.
자, 덴템포 불래요. 말해 벨라.
하나보다 베지도 잘 가사 직사는 가사 알레디.
말을 look at 주세요.
look at 주세요. 용용. section Shigari.
So Niti Shastra. So these kind of texts even have are seen as a kind of a genre of text referred to as Niti Shastra. How would you translate Niti Shastra? Treatise on norms.
Treatise on actually governance. Would probably be better.
Treatise on governance. So it's a whole genre of texts. So His Holiness is the earlier point that I forgot to translate, didn't finish translating, is that His Holiness was saying that if these great Nalanda masters were writing today, they would be writing about social issues.
Good. But I think that's really important for us to hear, actually, because the prevailing view of a Buddhist practitioner has the practitioner being somewhat individualistic and also somewhat passive. And I think that having an engaged perspective is something that, it's a re-articulation, or it's a new articulation of Buddhism. But looking for sources in, traditional texts is also helpful.
Yes, and I think I just want to say that you didn't quite hear the exchange here, but there also it's mentioned that there are a number of sutras as well, actually. More than one that also consider this. And no one can seem to remember the names precisely, but there are several sutras, actually. And there is a way in which I think a Buddhist version of, social policy, social activism could be created. Social responsibility could be created even now. A sort of vision of that could be created now, in part by looking back to some of those sutras and the Rinchen Chengwa and so on. So I think that's probably emerging, perhaps, Your Holiness, in the Buddhist world, a sort of vision of social responsibility, now that it seems to be part of being within the modern world.
Thailand, Burma, 이렇게 하는 연합은 한다. 근데 지금 지수 관리야, 지금 남배 캠프들 캠프. 저기 봐 지금 이제서 이렇게 하는 연합은 가. 저 가. 맞아. 들어 봐. 네가 한번 들어 봐. 안다. 버마다 타일랜드 대화기 다른 타일랜드 사시나? 그로 모더나이즈 롱고지를 받아. 지금 대화가 됐다. 지금 내려진 얘기 지금 숨숨 자셔도 되게 여러 매도. 두개. Yes, one heard. Buddhist economy said.
That's right. And also Sabardoya.
His Holiness is asking the monastic colleagues that in other Buddhist countries such as Burma and Thailand, because Thailand is quite well developed, were there monastic members who have attempted to write treatises dealing with contemporary issues and social issues.
And it was remarked that indeed there are some of these writings, some in connection with economics. Again, Laktor mentioned a name, Bayudo, And there's also
Sulakshika Raksha,
and the Sarvodaya.
Paisan, and of course Ariadne
Yes.
is another person
Yes,
in
and
this regard. And in Burma. So
and in
powerful.
Burma as well. There's what's known as the Sarvodaya, the uplift movement that has been very active in this way.
No, Sri Lanka.
In this is in
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka,
Sri Lanka.
yes, yeah.
Ariadne.
Oh, right, yes. So there are some. It's interesting that in the modern Buddhist world, some of this movement
Thich
has
Nhat Hanh.
begun. And of course, Thich Nhat Hanh,
Thich Nhat
we're
Hanh
forgetting.
is
Yes,
Right.
the
an important
Vietnamese.
figure in this regard.
Yes.
Taking in a certain way, very radical stance, and incorporating contemporary ideas into precepts and into ordaining of trees or organizing villages and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure,
also the ecofeminist movement in
Sanada
Southeast
institution,
Asia.
as a university, Sanada, our university, I think worthwhile make plan, organize one sort of conference, and invite from the different Buddhist countries.
no?
I think worthwhile. And there are some Western scholars also can participate. I think worthwhile.
His
Well,
Holiness is suggesting
you
to the
should-
Vice Chancellor of Central Tibetan University from Sarnath to actually organize a conference where speakers from the Buddhist countries, other Buddhist countries, as well as Western experts could be invited.
Buddhist monastic 도당 관리야 대행하고 직수하래. International Buddhist Conference 수하래.
Last year, Sarnath University hosted an international conference on Buddhist monasticism, represented by different monastic communities from different parts of the Buddhist country. Monastic traditions. yeah.
So the Yawman Assembly. 지소 관리야. 직토기나.
So His Holiness feels something like that would be very beneficial to talk about social responsibility and how do Buddhist communities understand them.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea. Richie just passed me a suggestion. I think it's really important to put it out here at this point. He said, in the spirit of integrating the best of the West and Buddhism, why not call for Elke and colleagues to collaborate with Jimpa and Buddhist colleagues to create a blueprint for an environmental social action? I mean, the first stage would be to really identify the movers in the Buddhist world, the monastic movers. And then, the second, and to really also articulate clearly the Buddhist principles. And those projects which are directly influenced by Buddhist principles. And then to bring Elke and colleagues together in discourse so we can draft an East-West blueprint.
Well, and I think certainly as part of His Holiness's proposal here, this could be part of the meeting in Sarnath, in fact, because one of the important questions is not only what's the conception of society and social responsibility and the pressing issues around economics and the environment, but also how do we change? What's a Buddhist vision of not just individual change, but social change? So I think that could be...
David Loy would be a great person. Next week, there's the international meeting of engaged Buddhists, and monastics are coming from all over Asia to Bodh Gaya to that meeting. I'll be attending and participating myself. Maybe you're available to come. I think it would be wonderful. I'll give you the information. Good.
잘 들어오래. 알래. 아까. 저 진리가 뭐래, 저나. 아니야. 저 유명이 요거래. 요거래. 자, 다 넘기는 게 있어야 돼야. 지금 부디즘 사디 따서 맞을 거지. Right from the beginning. And so when we use the word, the dialogue, Buddhism and modern science, and I made correction. This is a wrong word. We are not discussing. Discussion between modern scientists and Buddhists about modern science and Buddhism. No. you know. So in Buddhism, like this, is a lot of explanation about mind, and also not as detailed as Western sort of
Presentation.
physicist,
A physicist.
about particle. Although it's the explanation about particle also there. So that we can consider as a science, which mentioned in Buddhist literature, but itself not Buddhism, just science. So mind, we are not talking positive, negative. It's just, what is that? What's the reality of mind or emotion, these things? So that consider as a science. Then, on the basis also the reality, things are momentarily changing, and things are interdependent. So on the basis of that reality, Buddhist concept of impermanence, Buddhist concept of emptiness, absence of independent existence, these come on the basis of Buddhist science. But these Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist views, so the second is the group. Category. First category, science. Second category, philosophy. Then third category, now on the basis of reality, certain concepts develop. On the basis of that, then the practice, to achieve salvation. That's the Buddhism now. We never discuss with scientists about next life or rebirth. I will never seek advice from scientists about my next reincarnation. Either Chinese also, those Chinese communists. So these are Buddhism. This is the business of Buddhist. The other day I mentioned, any religion, no matter how popular, will never be universal. So we are discussing about whole world. So if we try to seek some answer from Buddhism, it's not right. There are many different religious traditions. And out of genuine respect, I think we should not create that kind of impression. So I always emphasize, we thinking how much contribution from our tradition, not propagating. So, some knowledge about mind and certain techniques to deal with this destructive emotion, which is mentioned in Buddhism, okay. Take not as a Buddhist practice. Buddhist practice must be certain goals, certain destination, right? Without that, not Buddhism. Right?
For example, to give an example of someone meditating, if the meditation,
samatha.
Like a cultivation of concentration, if it is not motivated by the aspiration to seek liberation, then of course you cannot call that a Buddhist meditation. Not motivated, not preceded by or rooted in taking refuge in the three jewels, then that practice cannot be described as a Buddhist practice.
So that kind of practice with aim, and
So the same practice, depending upon the goal to which the practice is being engaged in, if it is, say, for example, taking rebirth in, kind of high, advanced, kind of celestial realms of existence, then again it doesn't become a Buddhist practice.
Many years ago, I heard the Soviet KGB, some small program, which is cultivate Chung'eshi.
So trying to explore if people can cultivate kind of clairvoyance. Yeah.
For their spy work. So neither Hinduism, Buddhism, but simply, you see, a practice of meditation. So like that, you see, the certain sort of useful thing, wherever available, take for universal
Purpose.
purpose. Okay. So the other Buddhism,
So His Holiness is expressing a sense of unease when we characterize what's going on here. It's not so much Buddhism and science, but rather Buddhist science and philosophy on the one side.
Science
and
which mentioned in Buddhist literature or Buddhist tradition. So,
John?
Well, if there's time, I would ask one question to Your Holiness, which is, I've heard you say this before about the relationship between Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy, and I think it's a very useful way to understand our dialogue. But I do think sometimes, I wonder, a couple of things, Your Holiness, that if you could comment on them before we end. When we think of the idea, for example, the philosophical idea of interdependence, it seems actually to have a very important relationship to how we do science. And it took Western science quite a long time to come to the point of view where interdependence is the nature of reality. Now, I'm wondering whether that's because there wasn't a philosophical tradition in Europe that really strongly upheld the notion of interdependence. Whereas if there were great physicists in the Buddhist world, perhaps that kind of a notion of an interdependent reality would have come up earlier. So perhaps part of what I'm asking Your Holiness is what you see the role of philosophy and ideas around interdependence in the dialogue with scientists might play. Do these play an important role in changing the way we do science?
No. So of course, when engaging in discussion with scientists, the concept of origination by means of dependence that's a concept that constantly comes up.
Yes.
But on the other hand, if you are talking about dependent origination in terms of emergence of concepts, which are thoroughly contingent and dependent, then that is a concept not even all the Buddhists subscribe to anyway.
Only Madhimaka.
So for the time being, that's also not relevant.
Quantum physics,
But there could be areas where even that level of Buddhist understanding of dependent origination can, make a contribution. So, for example, in the quantum physics, as a result of very, minute analysis, at some point for some quantum physicists, the very notion of reality breaks down, and then which could lead to a kind of a nihilistic position that nothing really exists. So, in these kind of situations, the middle way philosophies kind of, characterization of reality in terms of radical dependence can be a helpful contribution.
Thank you, Your Holiness,
Thank you.
so much.